criteria is that it has to be considered a product of that country. You can't just bring something that might be from a non-eligible country and get it in. It has to have had 35% of its value added in the country to, again, so that you can prevent just a mere assembly of something in a country and then expect it to get in duty free. And it has to be imported directly from that country. So you can't have it circumventing going through some of these non-eligible countries so that they can benefit from it. And it's the idea is to develop some of these developing countries economically so that they are then in a better position to be able to, one, buy our exports, because these are really some of the countries who are in the poor situation. And I will say, just so everybody knows, that neither China nor Vietnam are eligible for the GSP, but the GSP is expired right now.
This Get Ready to Be Ready episode has been brought to you by the World Trade Center Arkansas. To ensure you stay up to date on new podcast episodes and more Get Ready to Be Ready series posts, be sure to follow us on Instagram at WTC.Arkansas and subscribe to our YouTube channel at World Trade Center Arkansas.
Hi, I'm Jana Carter, Trade Director and Foreign Policy Advisor for the World Trade Center Arkansas. And I am your host today for a Get Ready to Be Ready podcast, series of 3 on the Trade 1, 2, 3s and ABCs. We're having this discussion today. We're going to be talking about congressional ABCs, and I'm delighted to have a special guest here today, Nicole Bivens Collinson from Sedmer, Travis, and Rosenberg at their Washington, D.C. office to explain all of this to us. So today we're talking about congressional ABCs. So we're going to sit back and kind of focus on trade policy and Congress. And, I've been trying to think about how to relate this to Arkansas businesses, and one of the things that I came across is miscellaneous tariff bills. And I think Arkansas businesses might be interested in hearing about that and learning more about them and how they work. So can you tell us a little bit about them?
Sure. So the miscellaneous tariff bill, the MTB, is a provision that whereby companies in the United States can seek or petition Congress to get a duty on an input that they might be using either suspended or reduced for a 3-year period. The intent of this provision was for Congress to be able to waive those tariffs in order to increase production or to make the U.S. product more competitive on a global basis. Let's take, for example, if you were producing some sort of a paint here in the United States, you need a certain pigment, a certain chemical to make the pigment a red color, you would then go to your member of Congress and you would say, hey, I'm making this paint here, but this pigment, we don't make it. The only place I can get it is in Germany, and the tariff is 3.6%, and I really need it waived. Can you help me? So then you would go through a process of identifying the product, specifically by the harmonized tariff schedule classification number, and then a written description of what that product is. Those requests would then go to the U.S. ITC, International Trade Commission, where they would conduct an in-depth domestic review to determine whether or not allowing those products to come into the country would either harm or damage U.S. domestic production that may exist of a like or similar product, or if it exceeded over $500,000 in duties that might be lost, revenue lost coming into the United States. If it failed to meet those 2 criteria, in other words, it was under $500,000 and it would not harm a U.S. product, then it was probably going to be kicked out. They changed the process a little bit where they removed the petitioning to your member of Congress to do this. Congress gave the authority directly to the ITC and said, hey, ITC, we want you to initiate this every October or every 2 years, like every 2 years there's a new session of Congress. Every 2 years in October, initiate the process. The companies come, they petition the ITC reviews it, they make a list, they put this list together. It goes through a second vetting process, so it's not just the ITC. It then would go to the Department of Commerce. The Department of Commerce looks at it, and they then also initiate their investigation to see whether or not a U.S. industry is harmed in any way. If at the end of the day, everybody decides it's less than $500,000 revenue impact and it's not going to harm any U.S. domestic production, then it can go on a list, and Congress would then have to approve it, both the House and the Senate, and then the President signed the bill. And then at that point, you can see that your tariffs are either going to be waived for a 3-year period, or they might be reduced from 3.6 down to 2.6. Because again, they just want to provide you they can only provide you that $500,000 relief. So if they removed the 3.6 altogether, it was going to cost 1.5 million. They would say, well, we can cut it back to 2.6, which gives you at least some tariff relief. So it's been a mechanism to really help companies, particularly produce in the United States. However, it was designed for inputs. It became used for finished products. There's an effort right now in Congress to potentially renew and extend that because it's expired. All the MTBs that we used to have in place, they've all expired for the last 2 years. There's been no additional relief for the last 2 years. Congress can't get anything passed. But there's a potential that if they do pass something, it might change it so that no finished products could be used. So I wouldn't be able to bring in a fully done, can of paint. I could bring in the chemicals that I might use to make the paint in the United States, but I couldn't bring in the can of paint.
Interesting. So once something's placed on that list, how long does it? It has 3 years. It's there.
It has 3 years.
Okay, just curious.
Yep.
So, and what is the status of this discussion in Congress right now? But
Yeah, so it's pending. They tried to get something through last year. You may recall that we had the CHIPS bill, which was a
Yes.
bill to help with semiconductor production. But that CHIPS bill came out of 2 other bills. It came out of what was called the USICA bill in the Senate and the Competes bill in the House. And in each of those bills, they had a provision which would have reinstituted the MTB process
Okay.
for at least another 2 sessions of Congress, which means that in October of this year, you would have been able to petition the ITC to seek some tariff relief. And then in 2 more years, you would have been able to do it again. But that failed. Those provisions were stripped. Right now, if you listen to the Senate, which is in the control of the Democrats, the Senate Finance Committee has jurisdiction, and the chair of that committee has said very strongly he wants this provision in there, and that's bipartisan. Both the ranking Democrat and the chair, who's a Democrat, and the ranking Republican are in full agreement that they want to try to do this. On the House side, the Republicans are in control, but on the Ways and Means Committee, which has jurisdiction, the Republican chair has said very clearly as well, he wants to get the MTB renewed. So, I mean, there's a desire. It's just
Right.
going to see, I guess, what happens.
Interesting. Also, things that go on in Congress, preference programs. So generalized system of preference. What is that? How does that work? And again, we'll try to relate it to Arkansas businesses. So generalized
Right.
system of preferences.
So the GSP, again, we got the MTB, we got the GSP, and the GSP is a unilateral preference program that Congress has put in place, which will allow certain developing countries the ability to export certain goods. There's a finite number. Let's say if there's 17,000 options, they get 5,000 of those products that they might be able to bring into the United States duty-free if they meet certain criteria. The criteria is that it has to be considered a product of that country. You can't just bring something that might be from a non-eligible country and get it in. It has to have had 35% of its value added in the country so that you can prevent just a mere assembly of something in a country and then expect it to get in duty-free. And it has to be imported directly from that country. So you can't have it circumventing going through some of these non-eligible countries so that they can benefit from it. And it's the idea is to develop some of these developing countries economically so that they are then in a better position to be able to, one, buy our exports, because these are really some of the countries who are in the poor situation. And I will say, just so everybody knows, that neither China nor Vietnam are eligible for the GSP, but the GSP is expired right now.
So what is the status of that? Are we still talking about GSP being,
Yep. So GSP expired 2.5 years ago. So at December 31st, 2020, it went away. And GSP has expired this thing's been in place for the last 50 years. I think it should just be made permanent instead of going through this renewal every so often, for 3 or 5 years. We never know how long it's going to be in place, which is really bad for business, as you can imagine, from an investment perspective, from companies in Arkansas trying to manage what are my prices going to be if I don't know if I'm going to get it. So they are looking at trying to extend the GSP. It's in the same boat as the MTB. When you talk to the Finance Committee or the Ways and Means Committee, they talk about MTB, GSP in the same breath. And we're waiting to see whether or not that gets extended as well. But that again is another program for a lot of Arkansas companies that they may be able to benefit potentially from finished products as well as inputs.
So just real quickly to talk about GSP, what is the kind of the hang up? Are they trying to change some of the criteria that they place on countries that can, qualify for GSP status? I'm just trying to think
Yes.
of that. Yeah,
And there's a disagreement. Yeah, I mentioned the two bills that were competing. There was the
right,
USICA bill in the Senate,
right.
and there was the Competes bill in the House. And what popped out was the CHIPS bill. But in each of those, they had a trade provision that talked about the GSP, and each of them had different changes that they were contemplating to eligibility criteria, to the competitive needs limit waiver, different provisions in
Yeah,
the
right.
GSP that they were trying to change, and they didn't agree on what it is. So we're kind of in that same boat, trying to figure out what's going to come through at the end of the day.
Talking about the, kind of the basis or the reason for GSP, it's a similar, I think, reason for AGOA, so our African Growth and Opportunity Act. It should kind of like spur, economic development and, prosperity in the region. So can you talk a little bit about AGOA?
Sure. So the AGOA is the African Growth and Opportunity Act, as you said. That encompasses 38 countries it's in sub-Saharan Africa, so it doesn't include North African countries. And it was a program that was put in place in 2000, the idea being to provide an alternative for sourcing where a lot of investment was going, which was in Asia. It has had a slow start. Part of that is just due to the timing, because by the time the bill was finally passed in 2000, it became law. The quota system that was in place, which was a restraint system on apparel in particular, was getting ready to be removed in 2005 on all the other countries. So companies, one of the first in developing nations that you see is going to be your extractive industries, oil, minerals, critical minerals, that type of thing. Then you're going to see agriculture. Many of these countries, their agricultural products don't make it to the United States because of our sanitary and phytosanitary conditions. And then the third area that we always see sort of blossom in countries has been in the apparel and footwear industry, because it's a high labor intensive industry, and it's one that starts getting people slowly into an industrial world, working in factories, which is different from many of these developing countries. But at that time, because the quota system that was in place on China, Bangladesh, India, Vietnam, Cambodia, these big apparel producing behemoths, those limits were getting ready to be removed. And so many of the apparel brands said, you know what, I'm not going to go into Africa because they don't have the infrastructure, they don't necessarily have the good governance that I need. I'm just going to wait a couple years until the quotas go away, and I'm going to stay in Asia. So that's what happened. But what we saw was in 2015, the AGOA was renewed for 10 years, which gave investors the confidence that if I put investment there, I'm going to
Right.
be able to export it. So right now we're looking at an expiration of September 30th, 2025. But that right now also sort of like, what is the status? Where is it? That one is also one that we're looking at trying to get renewed. And Congress, when they talk about MTB, they say MTB, GSP, AGOA, because what they don't want to see is a lapse of the program like they saw with MTB, like they saw with GSP. They don't want that to happen to Africa. And it also, the longer the GSP, the MTB, and the AGOA are lapsed, it's other countries that benefit. Many of that time, that is China that benefits. We don't want that to happen. We need to provide alternatives. It's clear from the prior administration to this administration, the signal is to companies to get out of China, find alternatives to China. So let's provide some benefits to those countries which it's more difficult to do business in, so that there is an incentive for them to move out of China and to go to these other countries and help this development program move forward. So, that again, it's in the same boat, waiting for renewal, and there could be some changes to that as well.
Yeah, yeah. As you just spoken, MTV, GSP, and AGOA, all of those, they're a kind of a wait and see for us right now. So for Arkansas businesses, we've certainly talked about NTD and GSP and the importance there of what that can bring to our businesses. What can AGOA do for Arkansas businesses? What is there something in particular that we should be mindful of or watching for as that kind of continues to play out?
So on that one, there are a lot of opportunities because one of the things the African countries are looking at is trying to build these relationships with alternative partners. Right now, we've seen China's been going there under their One Belt, One Road initiative, where they go into these countries, they build roads, they'll build railroads, they'll build ports, they'll build energy facilities, and they'll give them a loan to do it. And then whenever the loan comes due and the country can't pay for it, they're like, oh, we're going to have to take over that facility. So China is kind of getting themselves really embedded into a huge continent rich with resources. And what we're trying to do is, take a different approach and get companies to form these linkages. For Arkansas in particular, there's a lot of apparel production that's going on. There's a lot of cotton that's grown in Arkansas. So there's clearly a recognition of things that a need there. There's a lot of food that's produced in your state. And they are dependent, and they had been very dependent on the Ukraine and on food coming out of Russia. We have huge sanctions on Russia right now. The United States is asking these countries to uphold our sanctions and to not accept that. If they're going to do that, they need to have an alternative. What is my alternative? You're going to tell me I can't source from them, then give me somebody else from which I can source. And by building these relationships, by having this program that brings the two countries closer together, it provides greater opportunities for exports. It provides greater opportunities for importing inputs that are essential for manufacturing in the U.S. too.
Well, Nicole, thanks so much for the discussion on what's going on in Congress as far as these programs go. Certainly, you have your finger on the pulse of Congress, so I'll look to you to keep us up to date, and then I'll hope to keep our Arkansas businesses up to date. So you and I'll stay in touch. But for today, thank you so much for all that you've shared with us. I think it's really helpful, and I look forward to talking to you next time. Thanks.